All right, welcome to Refuel. We're working through 1 Corinthians. Tonight we're going to be in chapter 11. If you're working through Wiersbe's study guide, it's study chapter 9. Wiersbe calls this being wise about church order. And he starts chapter 11 praising the Corinthian church. He says, I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the teachings, just as I passed them on to you. Teachings, your version may say ordinance, or it may say traditions. But I've learned from reading Paul that I think if I was receiving a letter from him and something started out good, I'd be concerned. Because there's always something else coming from Paul. Right. And this letter is no exception. This chapter is no exception. And he goes on to say, I want you to realize, and he goes on to start to, just right from nice to see you to let's get down to business, and he starts to lay out a hierarchy of order. And we're going to spend tonight looking at why and try to discern through our own cultural veil exactly what he's saying and what the relevance to us. Because remember, this is not from Paul, this is from the Holy Spirit, through Paul. First to the church of the first century, but to our own church in the 21st century. And what he says was contentious then, and let's be honest, is contentious now, if we are not careful as to how we view it and perceive it. So the first thing I want you to consider is the cultural context of that day. Because this is what we start out with is a gender issue, okay? But the culture of the day is important that we understand. In the Roman Empire of the first century, and because Corinth is in Greece, let's say the Greek culture of the Roman Empire in the first century, as well as the cultures to the east through the Holy Land and the Middle East and all these regions at that time, women were secondary citizens. They were not entitled to the rights that men had in any way, shape, or form. And Paul starts here in chapter 11 as the whole chapter is about disorder in their public meetings, and we're going to look at different aspects of that. But the first one has to do with the men and the women, a gender issue within that church. And in the opening of this chapter, where Paul says, he praises them for keeping the ordinance or the tradition or the teaching that he has given them, this is an important context to remember, because we're talking about the ordinances, the traditions that come through the Word of God, as opposed to the ordinances and traditions and teachings that come through the world view. So we have God's view and the world's view, and this is where he starts addressing this issue of disorder as it revolves around gender. Okay? He acknowledges that they are, through this letter, that the church is blessed. They abound in spiritual gifts. But here he's bringing to light they are lacking in spiritual grace and discernment. And here's where we can find, as we move forward, the lesson for us. Not so much whether or not we have the gifts, but whether we know how to apply them in a way that honors God. That's really what this is all coming down to. And this chapter deals with three particular areas of confusion within the public worship that was being expressed within the Corinthian church. And the first of those three areas is the issue of women praying and prophesying in the public worship. This is seen in verses 3 through 16. So again, we have this culture, as I was starting to say, of this disparity of gender within that world at that time. But in the midst of that, this new thing started to rise up. this new movement, this new teaching, this new church, which became known as Christian. And from the words, the teachings of its founder, Jesus, through the establishment of the church after his ascension, we see everything about it being countercultural. And that's at the root of what we're talking about here. Because in the new church, there was not this disparity of gender. And in that culture, it went beyond that. There was an inequality that was celebrated between the haves and the has-not. And it divided along many lines. Lines of race, lines of ethnicity, lines of social and economic standing. Those that had flaunted it boldly and made no apologies for it. Those who did not have, did not have. And there was no effort in that culture to equal the playing field except in this new Christian thing, this church that was rising up. And part of the fallout of that in the Corinthian church was you had sisters in Christ being taught, embracing this new scriptural equality that came through the Christian teaching. And they have a sense of emancipation. I mean, they're going around the church hanging up banners, "You've come a long way, baby," because they're so excited.
Yeah.
And in this excitement, where now they can participate in the public worship, they can pray as part of it, they can prophesy if the Spirit brings them a word from God. But they became so intoxicated by this newfound freedom that they were actually reaching a point where they were disrupting the order of service and, gasp, uncovering their heads.
Yeah.
It was like, we don't have to be secondary anymore. We don't have to be presenting ourselves as secondary. They were taking off the veils, hair blowing in the wind, running barefoot on the beach, right? The mamas and the papas playing in the background, California dreaming. And Paul is saying in this letter, slow down, ladies. Slow down, ladies. Why? Because he does not say you do not have this freedom. He acknowledges they do. Why is he putting on the brakes?
Because it's out of order, because the Lord is the head of the man, and the man is supposed to be the head of the woman. But they were not getting what they needed to get at home. So they felt like they were just out of control, doing what they want to do, just disrupting everything.
Okay, and we're going to work through those particular steps as we work through these verses. But yes, that is what was at the root, is their participation came so fast that it was actually disrupting the public worship, the order of the church. And it was literally reaching a point of becoming scandalous. As we work through this section, we're going to be looking at questions 1 and 2. So I'll just draw your attention to them now. Question 1 is, why was it so important that the women who were praying and prophesying in public worship continue to wear the head coverings, which were traditional? And why did Paul warn women against wearing their hair short? How might this apply to us today? Consider those questions. We're going to answer them as we reach the end of this section of the study tonight. So they have a new freedom, and the way they are expressing it is, again, impeding the order, shocking the church body and the community around it. And part of this, what was very visible, was the idea of a woman's requirement in the society to be covered. All right, and Paul references this both by the adornment of women and the expression of longer hair in the way they wore their hair, and also a covering, a veil or shawl over the top of their heads when they were in public, when they were in worship, when they were praying. If these were part of the restrictive culture around them, the Greek culture, the Roman culture, it all came together. The Eastern culture that would have been impacted the Jews and anybody from that part of the eastern part of the Mediterranean. By showing up in the worship with their heads uncovered, why is Paul telling them not to do that? Because we've already established they don't have to from a godly equality point of view. What's the big deal?
Well, for their culture, it was that they was not under anybody's authority.
Okay.
Mainly their husband's authority, and then to be covered by the man.
Okay. Before we get into what Paul breaks down as the Christian, what was the hierarchy in the secular culture of that day?
The man was the head.
Man was the head over the woman. Man could talk. Woman could not. Man could walk around publicly visible. Women were to cover. Consider it, it's not a dead issue. If you go to the Eastern cultures today, whether you talk the extremism of the extreme fundamentalist cultures, even in the more moderate cultures, you will usually find women with some sort of head covering on. It is the tradition.
The only restriction they had also for that man was that his hair could not be long.
Yep, we're going to get to the distinctions of a gender identity here as we proceed, so let me see.
Yeah, I'm not getting this chest be covered thing. I'm not.
Say again?
I'm not getting why does the woman have to be covered?
It starts with the culture surrounding the church. That was what respectable women did.
It was the norm of the day.
It was the norm of the day.
Okay.
So you had a woman would wear her hair long. That was expected of women. She would wear her head covered. That was expected of women in the surrounding culture.
Right.
So this was kind of a slap in the face to it if you just disrobe yourself and said, I don't need to.
But within the church, so the ladies are getting mixed messages. They know the culture they have been living in, but now this new Christian teaching, which they have come into, they are born again. They understand the freedom that the gospel gives, because the gospel, contrary to any other fellowship within that cultural time, brought everybody to an equal standing, regardless of gender, regardless of social and economic and racial and ethnic. The gospel brings everybody together, and these women were like, yes, Louise.
So the women covered themselves as respect for their husbands so that another man wouldn't be looking on them.
Okay,
And
again,
that was one of the reasons the women did cover themselves.
it was an idea of protection of the
Protection,
feminine
respect.
within the culture. Yeah.
I have a different reason that is totally not like these reasons
Okay.
that I read.
Okay.
So in Corinth, it was not uncommon for prostitutes, loose women, to shave their heads and wear blonde wigs, signifying their availability to the men in the streets. So no respectable Christian woman would go out in public dressed as a prostitute, and it was equally important that she not participate in public worship without a head covering.
Exactly. And not just the Christian woman, but the respectable women of society in and outside of the church. So hang on to that thought, Peg.
My commentary mentioned that women of that day that were married covered their heads like we wear a wedding ring.
Okay, so it was a symbol of maturity and perhaps a marriage bond. But let's go back to what Darlene and
It
what...
shows that you had some type of authority over you, because that man was your head, which was your husband.
Okay.
And then the ladies that Darlene is talking about, they had nobody over them. Diana was running stuff over them.
Exactly, exactly.
So
Yes.
there was no authority. They could do anything they wanted, and those were those type women.
Right.
That's what they called them.
Well, yeah. So the other side of the surrounding culture was, whereas respectable women did this,
Right.
those of lower or shadier moral character, all right, the streetwalkers, or in that wider culture, remember, in other religions, in the pagan temples, prostitution was a part of the worship. So there were temple priestesses, temple prostitutes, who did not abide by the cultural standards of being a decently presented woman. So they would cut their
Hit right now.
They're coming. I don't know where he is, but I got a whole tray coming in for all of you.
I got some sombreros in the gym I can bring in.
But the connotation goes the other way, that yes, the women of ill repute already were established that they would wear their hair. You go, girl. The ones who you did not want to be associated with, cut their hair very short, shaved their head, did not wear any kind of covering. They flaunted because they were not under the authority of a man or society. They were under the authority of a temple, which set whole different standards. And like I said, the standards of worship were completely unacceptable now as you have the Christian church establishing itself. So there are messages sent. And I'm not even talking within the church yet. I'm just talking within the culture at large. There were messages sent by how a woman presented themselves, okay?
When they found that newfound freedom, that liberty, that's when they were hanging the banners and throwing the parties.
Exactly. And they were not wrong.
Right.
They did. The gospel does bring equality to all of us. But we come down to, A, looking at the divine scheme of God versus the scheme of man, as we now look at what the issue is with the church women deviating from the cultural norm. Now, in any culture, including the Greek culture, our customs define our identities, including our gender identities, our roles, our relationships, our responsibilities. And we have to make a difference between God's scheme and the world's scheme or sense of order. In the world, the norm is difference always seeks superiority. We seek to identify differences in each other so that one group will attempt to establish dominance over the others. Difference means lesser from the eyes of the one who is viewing it in a worldly culture, and we've seen examples of that countless times through the progression of human history. But in God's scheme, difference does not equal inequality or inferiority. Difference is expressed as a celebration, because from all the different aspects of difference, we celebrate God and celebrate Him together. So we cut through the power play of the world so that we see that whereas order in the world often refers to subjugation, order in God's scheme relates to peace and unity. So in church order, which Paul is saying, well, we'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
No, we'll get to it now. We'll get to it now. What Paul is saying, what is Paul saying when he says, stop leaving behind the world's culture because of your freedom? Why is he saying that? Why is he saying keep your heads covered, keep your hair long? Mary Lynn.
I think he wanted them to relate to the world their sense of order and decorum, so they didn't push them aside. They wanted to keep the door open so they want to come into the faith.
Okay. If there is a sense of order that is in some way relatable to the world you're trying to evangelize, you make a point of connection. Yeah, that's a very good point. Okay. So part of it is that. Another comes down to, and this puts it in the context of the two chapters we've already looked at that surround chapter 11, chapter 8 and chapter 10. It's the idea in a military context of what hill are you willing to die on? In other words, what victory are you going to pursue at your own personal cost? We saw this with the idea in chapter 8. What was the issue there?
Just a minute.
Okay. Wasn't that long ago.
That was the meat, right?
Food
Sacrifice.
sacrificed to idols.
Yes, yes. We were talking in chapter 8 and revisiting it in chapter 10. Yeah, not this comes right after that. I'm sorry, not sandwiched in between. But in both of those chapters, we were looking at the dilemma of whether believers can participate in meals where the meat was, in all likelihood, sacrificed to a pagan deity. And what did Paul say there? What was his response to them regarding that?
Don't do it.
Well, not necessarily don't do it, but
But
Depends on who
respectful,
you're
I mean,
with and what
it's, you
you're
know,
doing.
but why, Suzanne? What was his main reason for saying be discerning, be respectful? Respectful of whom and for why?
to the others, because you don't want to make it like something that you want to do. You don't want to put it in, it's almost like an addiction, sort of speak. You don't want to put it in front of them and then
In front of who? In front of who? Where was the distinction in those chapters? It was between two different categories of Christian.
Greeks,
No?
Jews
Jews and Gentiles.
No.
Christians and non-Christians.
Mature and non-mature, strong or weak. Sierra, what do you want to add?
So essentially it comes down to, if I'm understanding right, is it more important for you to have your freedom and go against the expected, or to be able to find an approachable way to
Good.
relate to non-believers or
Perfect.
believers?
Perfect.
And not offend somebody so that they would miss it.
Right, so that we don't put a stumbling block before those who are not confident enough in their faith to understand what you're doing.
That's what I meant.
And you said it very well. So what we're seeing reinforced in chapter 11, after we've looked at chapters 8 and 10, is that the underlying theme of those chapters was not the steak.
No.
It was our approach to that cultural element and the idea of not being a stumbling block to somebody else. That's the same thing here.
Right.
When Paul is saying to the sisters in the church in Corinth, don't throw away the traditions of honorable womanhood,
Right.
as that was culturally defined then. Because what are you going to gain by doing that? Do you advance the gospel? Is this the hill you're going to die on? Is I don't have to wear this thing anymore?
No, but you can feel the wind in your hair.
I miss that.
No
Paul was also letting you know that even though you were a Christian and you were doing what the other ones were doing, then you looked just like them. So there was no distinction, you know, if you was not following the order that had already been set up.
Okay, all right.
Because at that time, you know, they were making big money off the prostitutes over there.
Oh, sure, in the
And
pagan
it
temples.
was a big entity, and
Sure.
it was very valuable to them. They came in and made great wealth off of it.
Okay.
So you didn't really you always want to be different. It's like, I don't eat pork, but why are you going to sit down and eat pork chop in front
In
of me?
front of you. That's right.
And it's
That's
going to
right.
cause me a problem.
Right.
So it's the same kind of idea.
Right. So we look at, because we are to be separate from the world, right?
In the world, but not of.
In it, but not of it. But here, what we're being called to, and here it focuses mostly in this part to the sisters in faith. If you deviate from the cultural norm, where are you going to do it so that you advance the gospel? And where is it not doing that? So Paul is bringing it there. Michael, what do you got?
All right, my question was, where is, why is it, I'm trying to figure out what the difference between women do it and men do it, and then a cup of wine on the table in front of alcohol.
Right, we don't want to make stumbling blocks.
Yeah, but if the person who's not supposed to drink at the table in front of the home, right? I mean, what's he doing last there anyway? They need to drink these things. Did God say when it starts to move and the wife starts to move? Don't touch it.
Right. So you have again the weaker who is going to abstain completely, whereas the more mature can say, I can participate here within reasons as long as I continue to honor God. I was at a social gathering recently, where as we sat down to table, the host brought out a bottle of wine. And the first thing he did was look around the table and say, is anybody offended if I open this? Will anybody have a trouble with it? Because he was ready to put it away if that was the case. So it's being constantly attuned, not just, and again, like we talked about last week, these women had a right to deviate from the cultural standard, uncover their hair, change their hairstyle, do whatever. Paul's saying, to what end? Does it advance the gospel? Because if not, all you're doing is causing disorder, confusion, contention, not only for those that might want to come into the church, but to those who are within the church.
Is that what he's saying?
It is what he's saying.
Okay.
Mark?
So 1 Corinthians 9, verse 20 through 23 really sum it up.
Go ahead.
Paul says, when I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew,
Yes.
bring the Jews to Christ. Then it says in verse 21, when I am with the Gentiles who do not follow the Jewish law, I too live apart from the law, so I can bring them to Christ. Then in verse 22, when I am with those who are weak, I share their weakness, for I want to bring the weak to Christ. Yes, I try to find common ground with everyone.
Good. Yeah, it does sum it up. And it's right. This is still a continuation of that theme. Yeah, perfect. Perfect.
Can I throw something out there?
Yes.
I mean, I don't want to start a fight or nothing.
Oh.
But even with this conversation with Paul, is something so strange about it, because this was such a big deal in this church about the women. But then when you think about the character of the two,
Of which
of
two?
man and woman.
Okay, of man and woman.
We know that the man is supposed to be the head of the house, and the woman is supposed to be the weaker vessel. But we know from our culture, just right here, that we wear more hats. We talk more, we engage more.
Sure.
You know, men are more on a quieter note. We're not going to say they're the weaker vessel because they do the heavier work.
Okay.
But even with this conversation, it's something about it with him addressing the women. And I'm just looking at it like, okay, she has, most of the time, she has a very strong influence, where men are more quieter.
Yeah, that's and just in the nature of
And
the.
that's the nature of the person.
Sure. Yeah.
But it's something more to it.
There is. So now I want to get to what you had started to say earlier, as Paul lays out his defense for this. And he says, in terms of church order, there are three self-evident fundamentals that we must consider, okay? That establish the defense of why Paul is saying what he says. In verses 3 through 7, it's the idea of redemption. It's the idea that this is not a different human culture that the church people should be fixating on. This comes from God, okay? So he brings God into this quagmire of gender identity and appropriate behavior and all of that. And the divine order, the order that we receive, the example of order from God, has to do with headship.
Yeah.
And my one commentator, Leon Morris, flat out says that as that's translated from the original Greek, it's not real clear exactly what Paul is saying in terms of the actual translation. But we go again with context to help us confidently move forward. So, and what Paul does, and we see it starting with verse 3, he says, I want you to realize, as he talks about this order of headship, The head of every man is Christ. The head of the woman is man. The head of Christ is God. So he sets up a very distinct order of headship. Okay? And we have to consider this in everything it's saying, because, even Jesus said, I don't do my will, I do the will of my Father. I'm here to do his work. I do nothing of myself. I am here to do his will. But yet we know the Godhead is one. But yet we also see in the persons of God an order, a headship. The Son proceeds from the Father. The Father does not proceed from the Son. Mike?
There's sort of, in the Old Testament, the men nowadays in the Jewish synagogue wear their hats.
Yeah.
Yes, they are covered.
Women do not.
And we're going to get to that in a moment, but yes. Okay. Because that is a very important observation. But hang on to that for a moment as I work through this. So we have God. Paul is enumerating the headship as it comes down through the Scriptures. Okay? He goes on. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. Every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is just as though her head were shaved. Okay? And he goes on from there in terms of emphasizing the disgracefulness of deviating from the cultural norm as it applied to gender identity. Okay? But he's talking about the Father and the Son and the headship relationship there. And then he's talking about the man and the woman. And it's not as simple as one is first, one is second. We do a disservice if we just take it there and shake our fists at the heavens saying, no, we're liberated now. Janie.
Well, I don't know how to say this. I don't like what he said, but he said, because he says, but I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ. The head of every woman is man. So in other words, woman can't go right to Christ. She has to go to man first to go to Christ.
But it doesn't. It doesn't. The context of the original language. And see, that's what's important. When we take these words in, we have to remember we are working through translation, not just of words, but of cultures. We are 21st century Americans reading words which sound offensive. Any person today, male or female, that embraces the idea of gender equality on the surface is going to look at this and be offended. That's a given. So yes, Jane, you're absolutely right. Josh?
So I took it as Paul is establishing a chain of command, right? As you covered. But it also says that, however, it doesn't imply inferiority on one part of those under the headship.
Exactly.
Rather, the orderly nature of God's design, the headship provides the covering under which people are to function and work.
Exactly. And that's taking it into a broader spectrum of consideration than we tend to do just reacting to the words as we hear them. When we talk about headship and we talk about honoring the head, there's a couple of different considerations here. One is the head of the person who is praying, but more importantly is the authoritative head of that person as it's giving in this godly order. So as we said, the Son is not inferior to the Father, but he willingly subjects himself to the Father for the order of the eternal plan. Okay?
And it tells us that even though they're one, the Trinity, they have three different functions.
It's one God, but three persons with different functions. And again, there is an order to the functions.
That's right.
The Father is first.
That's right.
The Son willingly gives himself as second, and the Holy Spirit cannot come into the plan
That's right.
fully until the Son has done his work.
That's right.
So we see this progression, but this idea of headship and chain of command, unlike in the human worldly model, does not imply inferiority or secondary status. And that's hard to get our heads around because that is so countercultural.
The order still sits today in the church. Our pastor is our under shepherd.
Okay?
He answers to the Lord, right?
Yes, he
And
does.
so as the Lord blesses him, according to the word, the blessing flows down to the skirt, which is actually the body.
Mm-hmm.
So if he's out of order, 9 times out of 10, the body's out of order.
Yes,
It still
because of his
applies
leadership.
today.
It does still apply today. It absolutely applies today. So we see the idea within this scope of order that whether you're looking up to the head, up to the Father, or down from the Father to those below him in the order, you see a continuity of respect and acknowledgement and love and validation, okay, which we don't find in the human model. And since we're so accustomed to the human model, these words will tend to offend as we first read them. But when we talk about a woman praying,
Yeah.
we have to consider the whole sequence. Yes, it says the head of the woman is the man. The head of the man is the Christ. The head of the Christ is the God. When a man prays, so now it comes down to what glory is represented in each step of this.
Yeah.
So the Christ readily taught, my glory is not my own, my glory is my Father.
Right.
So the Christ, the Jesus takes that, and when it says man's head, his glory is the Christ. When he prays, if he covers his head, he's covering his glory.
Mm-hmm.
But his glory is Christ. He should not do that.
Right.
Because we want to have nothing between us. When the woman is said, and he says, cover your heads, cover your glory, you think about it. She's not praying. Who is she praying to?
She's praying to the Lord.
To the Lord, to God through Christ, as he taught us to pray, right? So when she covers her glory, what is she covering? The man, the male, because she is going beyond that.
She's cutting him out.
To the Godhead. She's keeping him covered. Yes, don't get any ideas, but yes, that's what it says. Yes, it does. That's how the commentators I've got explain it.
Up to God. Okay.
So if the woman cannot
Well, that makes more sense.
acknowledge the man and still look beyond him to the God.
You can see verse 7 is pretty offensive if you don't
I know.
know. But you also have to put Genesis 1, 26 and 27.
Exactly. And hang on to that, because once we get past the redemption, we get to the creation. So the first self-evident fundamental is this redemption, this godly order, eternal order of headship. The second fundamental of this defense is creation, where Darlene is going right now, reflected in verses 8 through 12, where now we see in the creation of the natural order who was created first.
Man.
Okay. The man was created first by God from inanimate dust.
Right.
Right? The woman is then taken
Out of man.
from the man and is given life there. The woman, as Genesis reads it, was created to be the appropriate helper to the man. The man was not created to be the appropriate helper to the woman. Like it or not, this is the order given to us through the creation that we must acknowledge and understand how we can be a part of that without being relegated to secondary standards, status, and how we can honor God in our different roles as male and female. And then Paul goes on further. He says, remember, ladies, the man didn't come from the woman came from the man, but
Right.
It's a big but.
from there going forward,
Right.
man proceeds from woman. So what is he doing? He's showing you can't just cherry pick one part of this and make that your doctrine. We have to look at the totality of what God reveals to us. And this is expressed through Genesis. You can see it in the creation, through the book of Genesis. It's reflected in the first letter to Timothy. We come down to image. And it says the man was created in the image of God, but that's not where it stops, is it? What else does it say about the created in God's image? Give me another verse.
And his likeness.
In his likeness, but what else does Genesis say? After it says that, it goes on to say something else. Mike?
Male and female.
Yes. Hang on, Mike. Hang on 1 second. God is given to say, let us, a reflection of the triune nature of God, create man in our image, male and female, in our image. What does that imply to you? What can we reasonably draw from that?
We're both made in his image.
We're made in our image, his image. We are equals. It goes beyond that.
God is male and female.
That's hard.
The image of God is represented in both male and female. Maybe I'm stepping out a little bit here, but I'll present this to you for your consideration. I read this to say, neither the man or the woman independently represents the full image of God. We most celebrate God
Together.
in the togetherness, because that's why in chapter 2, it then proceeds to say, so the man shall leave his father and mother and cleave, be united to the wife with such intensity of purpose and covenant that the two stop being two separate things. The two become one, become new, become what? Oh, I don't know, born again? A new creation? We see it from the creation story. We see it as God expresses his view of male and female, and that's where we have to take our model of order and image and glory. Mike?
That kind of changed because in the beginning, God made a male and female, and the woman was used the man to help me. And it worked that way. So in order to have, and then so he got, after we sinned, though, before we sinned, we didn't need to help me. I mean, we were pretty cut down. I mean, we were granted. And then we sinned, and then now, man needs to help him.
No, he didn't sin until he got the help.
Yeah, I wasn't going to bring that up.
It's like the kids, the children, you need to help them. You didn't listen to the wife, your kids in jail time it's crazy.
It works best when the male and the female work in unity and partnership together, honoring God. Again, we're back to this isn't contractual. This is covenantal. A huge difference. And and as we saw, the woman and the man were made in the perfection of the original creation, and together sinned and separated from God. So together, through the rest of human history, what we see as good and what we see as bad comes from the original common decision. Okay? Let me see. Wiersbe emphasizes that this notion of the equality as it relates through the creation, from the redemption rather, and into the creation, where it is applied, and now we're back to the reality of first century Corinthian church, where this is most relevant and important is A, in the church fellowship, and B, in the godly home. These are the places where what Paul is saying must be adhered to because of the defenses he's given, the godly ordination, redemption, the nature of creation. Even there, he brings in, he says it's not just people, he says it's in the presence of angels. Why? What is relevant about that when he says, he talks about angels in this whole section? Okay, hang on. In verse 10. For this reason, and because of the angels, the woman ought to have a sign of authority on her head. What does that have to do with anything? the angels. Nephilim? I hope not. No, I don't think we're going to go there.
But he says that she should be covered as a sign of authority as for the sake of angels.
Okay, so
So the angels are actually representing authority at the same time.
representing authority, maybe.
God's
Submission, definitely. But so is this, what is being implied by bringing in, introducing and reminding them of the presence of angels? Josh?
Worship.
It involves worship. It's taking the whole thing off the human plane. He's saying this is not valid only here, this is valid in the courts of heaven. The angels are a reference to the godly ordination of what Paul is writing here. Right?
Well, he also says that all the same, it is true that in the Lord, woman is nothing without man, nor man without woman. But just as the woman came from man, so man is also born through the woman.
Exactly. So we see there is no grounds for an attitude of superiority between the genders.
I didn't understand the part about the angels, because they don't know anything about insubordination.
Oh, but don't
But they do.
I don't know, that's what the commentary says. I don't know. I don't understand why I missed the answer, I guess, when you were talking about why, because of the angels.
Well, after that,
Why?
it also says that, so man is born through woman, and all things are from God.
this
So it
is
just shows us that everything comes from the Lord. Even the angels up there, and at that time, they were representing high worship.
sure. And there is
So the one acted up there.
and there we see through the fallen angel that there is an expectation of subordination and subjugation, willing subjugation to God by the angels, because Satan did not, and Satan was cast out.
Right.
But again, we see the presence of the angels bringing this to the
Yeah.
level of deity and eternity. It's not just an earth thing. It's a heaven and earth thing.
Well, doesn't it say they're descending and ascending as we are praying? So they're bringing prayers, they're taking prayers.
There is a constant interaction. I'm not going to say intercession, but interaction of the angels in the affairs of humanity as it relates to God. Yeah.
So it says in verse 10, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels, because the angels are watching to see if we as women are under the authority.
Okay. We are accountable at all times, male and female, not just to each other or society, but to the purview of God, represented by angels. Okay. Anybody else? Any comments on this?
I think it has a lot to do with them taking prayers and bringing answers, because it always talks about the angels descending and ascending.
Okay.
And they're always present when we're praying. So they're actually delivering and working, because the Bible says that we have 10,000 angels that are assigned to us.
Okay.
But because we never put them to work, they're probably laid up somewhere with their legs crossed, twiddling their thumbs. But we don't know that we have that right. So even in prayer, they're working.
We see examples from Scripture are where angels most certainly are the agents of God in the affairs of humanity. Absolutely. Okay. The third fundamental defense that Paul gives, represented in verses 13 through 15, is nature itself. And the idea that in the creation and the expression of the natural world as we have it, there is no gender confusion. There are distinct gender differences. All right? The natural creation gives no place for the ideas of unisex or trans anything or gender neutrality. Gender is distinct and should be celebrated in our distinctiveness, male and female. So Paul's argument says nature itself says, and then he goes on that a woman is is best represented in long hair, a man in short hair, and he goes on and ties this to the idea of covering and authority and headship. So he goes from these three fundamentals as Wiersbe identifies them. The origin of God in all of this, redemption, the creation, and the continuing nature of the natural world. That we have submission, designed submission of the heart to the Lord, and that when we express in an honest and reverent way our gender identity, it is a public manifestation of our obedience to God's order. Now, that being said, let's look at these first couple of questions. All of that being said that we've just spoken about, why was it important for the women to wear head coverings in public worship? Sum it up.
Showing that they were under authority.
They show that they're under authority. Ultimately, what is it an expression of?
Glorifying God.
Glorifying God, honoring God, focusing on God. The small matters of the cultural stuff in the godly perspective are insignificant. Now, take that to question 2. Why was he, and we talked about it, so summarize it. Why was he warning women against untraditional haircuts, cutting their hair short, is the example given here. Okay, because it was an expression, a communication of an immoral attitude and character. Now, the more important question, the rest of question 2, how might this apply to us today? We talked about the cultural context of the first century Corinthian church. How about the 21st century church here in America? What do we take from this? Does it mean all you ladies need to have your hair long?
So that we're not a stumbling block.
So that we're not a stumbling block, but now let's look at this. Paul said very clearly, gender identifying things, what are we supposed to do with that? Does that mean, well, we don't have anybody here, but Josh has got to get a haircut? I mean, or that all of you ladies must wear your hair shoulder length or longer? What is the relevance to us today?
Uniformity. I say we're all together.
Say it again, Mike.
Uniformity.
Uniformity?
Like,
I don't know about uniformity.
Dress like a Christian.
I think we just want to be a good representation of Christ.
We do want to be a good representation. We do want to express ourselves as Christian. Gloria, can you clear it up here?
Men need to look like men, and ladies need to look like ladies. Viva la difference.
But what defines that? Are we still holding necessarily to that first century standard of gender identity or gender standards of what we should look like? Is it the same? Sierra, what do you think?
No.
I mean, not as severely as they used to, but even today, certain haircuts, you'll see a certain haircut on a woman and be like, oh, well, that looks like a man's haircut. You'll
Right.
see a man having a man bun or something like that, which, granted, 5 years ago would make people giggle, and is becoming a little bit more common nowadays.
Right.
So, I mean, there are still a certain amount of expectations for presentation.
That's a good way of putting it. There are still certainly expectations of presentation. My question is, should we be adhering to the letter of what Paul wrote in 50 AD to a first century church? To the letter, do we have to obey by that?
I don't think so.
Would that make us legalistic?
Okay, well, I don't know, does it?
I think.
There's something more.
When I come to church.
What was the essence of the first context I gave to Paul writing to them? What's the first thing we got to consider?
Play it back, Greg.
Josh.
To reject submission to authority is to reject God's prescribed order.
Okay, to reject submission to authority is to reject God's order. That seems to be a universal message we can take, but it's still not answering the question.
It was a targeted group of people that he was speaking to.
Targeted in what specifics, Steve?
Well, I don't know if I call it admonition, but he was addressing.
Who was he addressing? Believers when and where?
Corinth.
When? Last year?
Very bad.
50 AD. There's a cultural context
Yeah.
in which he wrote, and we can't ignore that. Do we still have the same cultural context?
So he's telling them to get it together, get their stuff together, because they
That's-
don't have it together, and that's why he's there.
Good.
To tell them,
Right.
enough.
Because there's disorder and chaos. And
Yes.
keep it in the context of the letter we've already been reading. This church had an abundance of issues, of division, of moral character, of order. We've seen it all the way through. We're seeing another example of it here. But in regards to his specifics about hairstyle and covering of heads for the women, not the men. And mind you, Paul was a Jewish man. Then, and to this day, Jewish men pray with their heads covered.
Yeah.
By a shawl, by a hat, by a yarmulke, something. Paul is telling the men, uncover your heads. What do we do with that?
But that's, I don't think that was then and this is now.
So what's the difference,
The difference.
Pat, and
now
what do we
is that-
take from the message?
The difference now, I believe that we still should have order. But
Okay, good.
we should be, we should be able to line our own lives up with Christ and what's good for us. Because what's good for me is not good for you.
Okay, yeah, that's true.
So, but we want to be pleasing unto the Lord, and we don't want to be a stumbling block to anybody else. I like my baseball caps back. I like lace
You look
fronts,
good.
I like jeans, I like boots.
But the point, but it
the
goes
main thing-
beyond.
But the main thing is that I first honor the Lord in everything that I do.
Okay.
And if it's not comfortable for me, where the Lord is checking me, then I don't do it.
That's fine. But is that any different from the women Paul is writing
They
to?
was doing anything they wanted to do anyway.
But they liked it?
They loved it.
So what do we do here? Do we have a cultural context now?
Not according to that, we don't.
Is our appearance, though, drawing attention to ourselves mostly, or is Christ most important?
Okay, there's a good
Dennis
question.
Rodman.
Okay, so that's,
Dennis Rodman was part of the church.
okay,
He was out on the basketball
That's
court.
right.
It was all about him.
No.
okay. Mark?
So it goes back to what Louise was saying earlier, and this is right out of the commentary for the angels from verse 11:10. The term may also be recalling the original authority that was lost over the Garden of Eden because Eve was uncovered. That is, she acted independently of Adam. So to answer your question, when we act independently from God, the wheels fall off us.
All very true, but it's not getting to the heart of what I'm asking, and that is we cringe when we hear Paul write in the Holy Bible, ladies must keep their hair long, men must keep it short, and ladies, you must cover your head. And then when we get a little later into this book, you know what else he's going to say? He's going to say, be quiet in church. Spoiler alert. He's saying, you got a problem, ask your husband at home. My point remains the same.
Church was all out of order.
But that's not the whole point. Do we have a cultural context in which we live right now?
Yes, we do.
Of course we do.
Yes.
Everybody does wherever they are, whenever they are.
Yes.
Is our cultural context the same as Greece in the year 50?
No.
It's not.
No.
Do we have today cultural standards for male and female?
Yes.
We do. They're being challenged. They are being challenged. And think about that. What is being challenged when we do that to the radical degree that we do it now? How do you not, in the context of this letter and specifically this chapter, how do we not see that as a fish shaking to God
It is.
and to the nature and the creation and everything else? But my point is, as we look and say, because I can hear you women, I ain't wearing my hair long and I ain't covering my head and I don't care what you say. There are standards today.
Right.
What was at the heart of what Paul was saying? Have order in your church.
Yeah.
Honor God.
Honor everything.
Honor your covering, your headship, your glory. Steve.
You just hit the nail on the head. There were specific things they were doing that were dishonoring to God, and he addressed those specifically.
Exactly.
Based on the time and place they all were at that time. We have different ways that we're potentially dishonoring God.
Okay.
And so those would be the different things that need to be addressed to us.
Okay.
That we need to address in order to get back in line to honor God.
Good. Because ultimately the question becomes whether it's the year 50 or the year 2024.
Am I pleasing?
What hill are you going to die on? What cause are you going to lift up? Does it honor God? James, because then I got to move on
I
here.
guess my question is, so what is the answer to how might this apply to us today? What is that?
We have to recognize our cultural standards.
Right.
Okay.
And then if we deviate from them, is it in ways that honor God?
Right.
Okay? If some man comes through here with hair down below his shoulders, is that an issue today in our culture?
No.
It's really not. So we should not make a first century cultural issue our issue. We need to get at the heart
Right.
of what was true then and is true now, because God is eternal.
And we have to be very careful with that, because you could cause somebody to miss it because you feel like it's an issue.
Yeah.
It's really not your issue.
So now we have to be
Yes,
honoring the word,
that's right.
honoring the intent as we move forward. I've got to move on. Any closing comments on this particular part? It's supposed to take 15 minutes. I only have 15 minutes left. But it's okay, because it was good. It was good. So the first particular area of confusion in public worship involved the gender issue, women praying, prophesying, etc. The second one, now we get into a different topic. Thank you. Was selfishness at what Wiersbe describes, and Morris references it the same, as love feasts in the fellowship.
Yeah.
What was the idea of love feasts? In the Christian context of that first century?
We celebrate it all the time.
Of what?
Time of sharing?
The love feast.
What kind of love is it about there?
It was definitely supposed to be a time of sharing.
Right.
The early church, that early church did not structure the way we do. For the most part, that first church coming out of the book of Acts, the church as it started to organize under the apostles after Jesus ascended from the earth, met in homes, met in groups. The focus was fellowship. Remember, they did not have a written Bible that was oral traditions of the Christ. The Bible was being written. Okay? But so it was oral traditions. They would gather and they would honor God in fellowship. It's literally the model from which we take our small groups, what we call here our Acts groups.
Right.
Because in the book of Acts it says they gathered together, they shared things in common, they broke bread together. Okay? So this idea of love feast was this gathering in fellowship. Okay? It was the importance of sharing meals. That reference to Acts that we draw the name of our home groups from is Acts chapter 2, verses 42 and verse 46. It was the idea of sharing. We spoke earlier in this letter that this was a very diversified fellowship. Okay, so you had not only different people from different religious backgrounds, different ethnic, racial backgrounds, but you had people of different social and economic backgrounds. You had those that had a lot.
Yeah.
Fellowshipping with those who had very little, who worked hard and lived, meal to meal, mouth to, hand to mouth type of thing. So the idea was the sharing with those who had not, in a way to honor God, but it was being abused. And Paul goes into it in the verses as we look at verse 17 through 22. He says, you people are making a mess of this.
Right.
Okay? You're coming together. Those of you that, you're like elbowing your way to the table. You're taking it all. The poor aren't getting anything. Some are going home hungry. Others of you are drunk and passed out. He's saying this is not orderly. This is not honoring God. So there was selfishness at these love feasts. And something that we must be so careful about as we exercise church in our own day, it became a gathering of cliques instead of fellowship. We have to be so careful with that because it's such a natural tendency. When we get together for a fellowship meal, an event, what might be considered a love feast. We've had them at the gym. We have dinners all the time. Well, we used to have them all the time. We still have dinners sometimes. Is everybody there participating together?
No.
Or do people come in and it's like, oh, yes, your table's over there.
Yeah.
Your table's over there. You don't have a reservation? And you find people that if they don't already have a group connection,
They're left out.
they are left out.
Yes.
And if they stay, if you pay attention,
Yeah.
you'll see them sitting by themselves at one of the farthest tables that I set up in the gym.
Right.
That's not fellowship.
No.
That's cliquish selfishness. Maybe it's not even intentional, but that's what's occurring. And you think about the impact on the person who walks in and realizes, I've got no place to sit.
Right.
And even goes to a table and says, may I sit here? Oh, we're full.
No.
God bless you. We must be so careful with this
You got it.
because it's too ingrained in human nature for us to overlook it. It will happen in our church, any church.
That's right.
So we must be careful of being selfish. And they were being radically selfish in their love feasts. The privileged were, partaking to excess. The poor were going away hungry. It's an evidence of a deeper church problem. It's a symptom of what? Of pride, of a lofty opinion of themselves, of really not caring about the other people in the fellowship, right? And then it expresses this way. The feast should be a time of edification, but in Corinth, it had become a time of embarrassment, and Paul calls them out on that. So let's go to question 3. That being said, in our own time now, how can we be more sensitive to the poor and needy in our own church fellowship?
Well, we're supposed to always see everybody, each other above ourselves.
Supposed to see everybody above ourselves. Yep, we're called it. Say again?
Include all, include them,
I'm sorry.
include them.
Include them. Right, absolutely.
How do you know they're poor?
Well,
How do you know who is, who isn't?
Even if they're not poor, you still want to get to know them and invite them into your
Exactly.
fellowship.
Exactly. It's the idea of inclusiveness in fellowship. How do we accomplish that? Especially as the church grows. I mean, if you're in a congregation of 30, 40 people, this isn't hard. You get 400 that routinely come on a weekend, like us. This can become a problem. Mike?
I was thinking, there's few unsaid rules that are not for people outside our church, but people coming to the outside are visitors.
Yeah.
For us, they have a few rules that we try and follow, is women and children go first, and newcomers.
Okay, all right.
It's a lady,
But again, that's...
it helps.
It does help, but as a church grows, that may be difficult to implement. But in our fellowship, as we grow, what can we do?
You always want to be paying attention.
That's big.
And then, even, we should all have the gift of discernment. So if you see somebody over there that's sitting every week by themselves, go over and say hello, or go over and sit by them.
Okay, good.
But, you've got to first show yourself friendly, because you really don't know who they are and you don't know what they're going through.
Right.
So we should be able to extend ourselves, not because they don't look like us or they don't smell like us. Those are the ones we're supposed to be looking for, instead of the friends that I sit with every Sunday.
Exactly. Think about it. Where does that Let's take it out of a feast setting. Let's take it to a Sunday service. Where does that begin? Where we can start to make a difference?
Walking in, standing
The
in the
greeters, the greeters.
The greeters. One of the things I have heard often over my years from people who come new is the comment how well they were received
That's right.
when they walked through that door.
Ruthie Brooke.
The whole greeting, I mean, if you can get from that door to this seat without somebody stopping and saying hello, that's very unusual here. Because we have such committed people that will say, hi, how are you? If they don't recognize, they'll introduce, they'll be proactive, like Pat's saying, to engage, because it breaks down those uncomfortable feelings of walking into a place new, whether you go to another church or not. Am I going to be welcomed here?
Well, that was the first thing.
Yep, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, there are some churches that have assimilation teams.
Ooh, that
So if
sounds...
there's new, if there's like somebody signs on a guest card.
Okay,
that
yeah,
they're new,
yeah.
They'll contact them throughout, or during the week.
Yes.
And then they will look for them the following week, and they'll introduce them to people.
Yeah.
Introduce them to ministries.
Yes.
Just really kind of come alongside.
Exactly. Because we have to be proactive.
Well, that was one of the first things that started me to come into this church.
Ah, okay.
The first time I came, you guys had an outside service.
Okay.
And every one of the guys that I met out there greeted us, and I was comfortable. But the next time I came back, you guys had service inside, and I met Ruth,
Yeah.
I met Penny,
Yes.
and I met Sue
Okay. Yep.
at the door.
Yes.
And it was just overwhelming, and I meant, wow, you know.
Yes.
So I was very, very comfortable.
Good.
And I really appreciated that, because that allowed me the opportunity to even want to come back.
Okay.
And
Good.
ever since then, you know, I started meeting different people, and hi, what's your name? You
Good,
know.
yeah.
And it made me feel very comfortable.
That's good. That's a
So
wonderful
that's
testimony.
very important in a
Right.
church when somebody new is coming,
Right.
especially when they don't know anybody.
Yes. It's huge.
And I've lived out here for almost 30 years,
Okay.
but that was my first and second time coming.
Beautiful. See? Sierra, and then I got to move on. I want to cover the last thing before we close.
I actually more have a question
Okay.
that pertains to it. Not everyone is personable. Not everyone is capable of freely going up to people
You're
that
right.
they don't know and speaking to them.
Very true.
Having said that, given our discussion of being welcoming to new people and finding ways to, help those that are new, how would you advise them to do something? Because they might be going, oh, well, I can't do that,
Sure, sure.
Or quite literally, I'm upset now because I have no way of taking part. How
Okay.
would-
Because this has been defined and I'm not in that comfort zone?
Or even physically incapable of doing it.
Okay.
I have known people that go into full-blown panic with the thought of having to speak to someone.
Sure, sure.
Not knowing.
Sure. What do you guys think? We are certainly all gifted differently, and some are much more easily wired to easily approach other people, and some people are not. What do we do with that, Mary Lynn?
How about just smile at them? There was a new gal, not even that long ago, just smiled. And she smiled back, and then she started talking to me.
Good.
Just-
We all have our talents
Yeah.
and our skills and our comfort level.
Yeah.
And I think we have to remember, it's collective. So what we do collectively, and we each do our little part.
Right.
Where we are comfortable, how we're comfortable.
You do what you
You do what you do, but with that being the goal. Steve?
I wouldn't be offended if someone in our church who feels that way is intimidated by that, coming over to me and saying, hey, I think that person over there is new. Would you mind go saying hello?
Right.
Sure.
Run into kids.
So to get to know each other and our strengths and our weaknesses, Suzanne?
Going back to the fact that this isn't a 40-people church either, there's so many of us, and I don't think the expectation is that every single person who sees a new person has to run over and give a great big old hug.
Because that would be overwhelming.
That would be somebody that you're talking to, that you're sitting with,
Sure.
that you're in fellowship with, that will be able to do that. I don't think the expectation is that we all have to do it. Not everybody is.
Not in the same way, certainly.
But there's enough of us that even just the vibe should be welcoming, even if we can't just say it. Like you say, smile, There's a way to body language to make a person feel welcome.
Yeah.
And a way to make them feel unwelcome.
Yes, there is.
You can sit and pray too, Lord, if there's new people
That's
here
right.
today.
Yeah.
Just let the Spirit move you.
There's always something for everyone.
Okay?
There are churches that after worship, the worship leader says, it's now time to greet someone.
Oh, yeah.
Next to you.
Turn to the person next to you,
So
say good morning.
turn to
Yep.
the person next to you.
And all the introverts cringe when
I've seen them under the seats on Sunday morning. Yeah.
Pre-pandemic, I mean, we haven't really done too much of that since the pandemic.
that's why every once in a while I'll joke, and introverts can now sit down.
Yeah. Mark?
It's just to get back to the original question, how can we be more sensitive to the poor and needy? Is there some churches have benevolence funds too, where, if somebody is struggling, they, had an emergency fund,
Yeah.
and just kind of, they were out of money, their car broke down,
Exactly, yes.
that kind of thing. I've seen that work really effectively.
And I have, here, yes, we do
Depends
this.
if we want to do that just monetarily or personally too. There's a difference between,
There's so many ways
so many ways.
in which we can do for each other, opening our eyes, opening our hearts, being attuned to the Spirit, being proactive. The last thing that I wanted, and we're not going to be able to cover it, but the third area of confusion in this church, I at least want to be able to mention it to you, was specifically in regards to the Lord's Supper, which takes us verses 23 through 34, the rest of the chapter. Again, then the Lord's Supper, the communion, was not a part of a worship, service like we do it now. It was incorporated into this love feast. It was an aspect of the meal. They would have the meal, and then they would remember, the Lord in the communion. And they were messing that up because they did not have a properly prepared heart. They were not doing it with an intentional manner, meaning avoiding sin. Let's see. If you're looking at the questions, the four approaches, and I'm just going to have to bulletproof them, and we got to close. The four approaches to a right attitude regarding communion is an attitude of the heart. It's question 4, is that we look back, on what Christ himself did, the broken bread, his body, the spilled cup, his blood, and remember how and why all of that was done. Number 2 is looking ahead. Participate in the communion, remembering that this is something he ordained until he returns. So in doing it, we don't just do it to remember the past. It's our expression of, you're coming back. And we trust that and we're waiting. The third is looking within, partaking of communion in a worthy manner. Again, examining our hearts. Judge and confess our sin to the Lord. They were not doing this. They were not examining themselves. They were examining each other. Oh, look at what that one's doing, right? No, we need to look at ourselves. Eating and drinking in an unworthy way, back to what we talked about in the love feast, brings judgment on ourselves. So when Paul says, and let's see, it would be the answer to part of question 5, how does one eat or drink judgment on themselves? It's by doing it in fellowship in a way that's not worthy of fellowship or the God that we're honoring. And the fourth answer to number 4 is looking around us, discerning the Lord's body, not just in the bread of the communion, but in the church fellowship, which gets back to how do we engage people? Discern the Lord's body. And question 6. Communion is a demonstration of unity and thanksgiving. We can't go closer to the Lord without growing closer in church fellowship. Again, Christianity is not an individual sport, it's a team sport. Got to close. Last comments? Pray with me. Father, thank you for what you teach us in this letter to the Corinthians, in chapter 11 in particular. Thank you for helping us understand. I hope that as we walk out of here, we have a little bit more understanding about what Paul's saying and what he's not saying. May we understand it in the context of who you are, your holy order and scheme of things eternal. May we be submitted to you, subjected to you joyfully and willingly in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you. Good night.